What happens when disaster strikes in the field and your gear totally lets you down?
Well, I can tell you because it just happened to me up in Alaska.
This week we're going to share some of those horror stories and what you can actually do to keep shooting.
And when things do go wrong and your equipment lets you down and you need some new equipment, there's only one place that I get my equipment, and that's Camera Canada. They're going to get you great prices, fast shipping, and if you use the promo code Bird Photo Show, they'll treat you extra special.
So Glenn, I know you went to a tiny, very remote island in the middle of the Bering Sea where you definitely don't want anything to go wrong with your gear, but it did. So what happened?
Yeah, I was just up on St. Paul Island, up in the Pribilof Island chain in the middle of the Bering Sea, as you say. It's an amazing place. I've always wanted to go there, and it's like in North America, probably the best place for sort of breeding seabirds. So you get these couple species of puffins and different auklets and things coming in to breed. Really spectacular place. Not the kind of place that you want to have gear problems because you definitely don't have any stores of any kind, let alone camera stores. And unfortunately, my big 600 millimeter lens was having some problems with the aperture.
Well, that doesn't sound great, and you're not the person that travels with a lot of backup camera gear either. Like, so if your main camera breaks or your main body breaks, you're definitely in trouble. But how did you actually discover that you couldn't stop down? It's not something that you see in the viewfinder, do you?
Yeah, it's kind of a strange issue. Basically, because a lot of times I'm shooting in aperture priority mode. So if I was putting the lens at say f8, the camera was thinking it was at f8, but really it was still at f4. So you'd actually would see through the viewfinder when you'd take the picture, I could almost see just for like a millisecond it would flash brighter.
Okay.
And of course, when you'd look at the images, you would see that they were significantly overexposed. I'm hoping that it just needs to be serviced and lubricated or something like that, and it's not a super costly repair. We'll see how it goes. But at the end of the day, for the whole shoot, I couldn't stop down, which a lot of times isn't the biggest problem in the world. But in this case, a lot of times I was really close to the birds on the cliffs, and you're doing these nice portraits, these headshots. You have very minimal depth of field, and I definitely would have wanted to stop down to like f8 or f9 to get the whole bird kind of in focus. Or, sometimes I recognized an opportunity where there was two birds together, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to have enough depth of field for
Yeah.
that. So basically, what I would do was quickly take a picture of one and then take a picture of the other. So move the point of focus from one to the other, and then in post processing on a couple of them, I did a composite where I could put the two birds together because that was really my only option to save the day.
I was gonna say a lot of people watching wouldn't really even notice this problem because they always shoot wide open, but I think you already mentioned a few important cases why stopping down can definitely make sense in nature photography as well. If we need just more depth of field on our subjects or if we have multiple birds in the frame. So stopping down in certain situations is definitely important, but I'm glad you were able to sort of work around the issue and it didn't totally ruin your trip.
Didn't need to stop down for a lot of the flight shots, but it was more those portraits, especially the headshots and the shots where there'd be more than one bird in the frame.
But it also shows you that you're sometimes this close to ruining a whole trip if something else broke or if it's somehow you could only shoot at like F15 or something, then you'd have been
Yeah.
in even more trouble. So it definitely helps to have at least some sort of backup solution with you if you're going to quite remote places.
I've been living on the edge for a while now because, I only have the one R5. On this trip I had my 7D Mark II with me just in case, but I'm always just dreading having to use that camera if something goes wrong.
Because I guess your 100 to 500 doesn't help you much if you break your F5 because you're not really going to doctor an R7 onto it.
No, I mean that's literally what almost happened to me in Papua. A once in a lifetime, very expensive trip, and I dropped my entire rig. I mean, it's honestly a miracle that nothing did happen. It landed right on the hood. Everything was fine. Although maybe that's why the aperture doesn't work now. But anyways, I dodged a bullet there.
Well, I think it definitely helps to have at least two camera bodies with you and two capable lenses, especially if you're going to remote places, because sometimes things happen like back in the day when my friend broke his 500mm lens in half, and there's really no
Yeah.
workaround in the field if you have your lens in two pieces. So having something else then with you definitely helps. At least it doesn't ruin a trip if you're on a remote place like that. But overall, it looks like at least you got some quite nice images.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really cool place to visit, and I definitely, for the like hardcore kind of North American birds, I definitely recommend visiting there. It was a very special place. However, there's one big thing you need to know about going there is it can be very tricky to get in and get out. The flights are it's almost like cancellations are the norm and them actually landing is the exception. When I was there the entire week before I went, all the flights were canceled. Miraculously, our flight, even though the pilot said the conditions looked marginal and he'd give it only one shot to try to go out there, we were able to land. Then the 5 days that I had planned to be there, no flights came at all. And ultimately, the only way that I got off the island was kind of stowing away on a charter flight. Some hunters came in to hunt some caribous, and I was able to purchase a seat on the charter flight to go back to Anchorage. So basically, I just barely got in, and the only reason I got out was because there was like this sort of special circumstance. So if you're planning to go there, make sure you budget some extra days, at least 3 and maybe even like 5 days after the trip to make sure you get home.
It's definitely one of those places I always had on my list I wanted to visit as well because it just seems like it's so crazy remote. And I don't know if you've ever seen this like crab fishing show, what they call Deadliest Catch. They
Yeah.
always go to that island as well. And I used to watch that sometimes, so I'm like, yeah, it's definitely a place that would be pretty cool to visit.
You know, it's funny. I'm used to going down to the tropics where there's hundreds and hundreds of species that you're looking for and chasing after, and there's basically endless sort of species diversity. Whereas here, you're basically after sort of, I don't know, 15, maybe 15 different birds. So you have a lot of time to spend to try to get really like high quality images. You know, if you want a bird flying and banking and looking at you, put the time in and you can try to get it. It's not like you're at, you know, there's only one or two of the birds. There's literally thousands of them flying by you nonstop. You felt like if you missed a shot, it wasn't the end of the world because another one's going to come around. And it was more of like a numbers game. I probably took at least 30,000 frames of these birds flying around.
Yeah.
And yeah, so ultimately it was really cool. Some different birds that I hadn't seen before, some sort of lifers, and some really cool memories that I'll treasure for a long time.
And I mean, everyone loves puffins, and so having some weird looking puffins is probably even more exciting.
Really cool place, but I think for me, visiting once was probably enough.
And you're lucky you're not still there.
I could literally still be there.
So we all know you like living on the edge, but it seems like you also have someone looking after you and your gear in the field because you're traveling to all these crazy places without ever really breaking down and not being able to shoot. So that's actually quite incredible. Sometimes gear breaks, like a lens snaps in half, you're screwed. But oftentimes there's definitely workarounds to still making it work. And you said,
Keep
for instance,
shooting,
you
yeah.
dropped your camera in Papua, but you were still sort of able to use it, dust it off, and it was still working.
I've dropped my camera a couple times over the years. The Papua one luckily just landed on the hood and it was fine. I didn't have to do anything. I just kept shooting. It was totally fine. But another time I had an even more catastrophic one. This was years ago, I think in Guatemala. And I was in my room, like, you know, just relaxing in between shoots. And I had my whole rig set up on the tripod. And I guess one of the legs wasn't quite tightened down.
Mm.
And it just sort of slowly slipped and slipped and slipped. And then boom, I just heard this crash. And I was like, oh my God. I went and the fall, it hit the body this time and it completely ripped the lens mount out of the camera, and the lens mount on the 600 was bent like this. Like it would had a serious problem. And I thought, okay, that's it. That's the trip over pretty much. And I kind of calmed down. I like composed myself. The camera was clearly a write off, like boom, straight in the garbage. It was done. But the lens, I mean, and I figured it's, first of all, it probably doesn't even work properly anymore. And second of all, like the lens mount piece is bent out like that. So how is this salvageable? But I looked at it and I thought, let me just try. And I carefully bent the metal back into place. I had a backup 7D Mark II at the time. And unbelievably, I put it back together and the lens still worked perfectly. So sometimes, even when you think all is lost, you can still solve it, but you have to keep your wits about you and stay composed in the field.
Yeah, I actually remember taking off a Nikon teleconverter with a big wrench once because it suddenly stopped working and it was stuck on the lens. And I was on a big trip with a friend and he actually paid me to take him out to the field, show him all these places. On like the first 30 minutes of the day, the teleconverter stopped working, but it was like just like glued to the lens. He must have put it on a weird angle or something. But then, yeah, I got the big wrench from the car. We actually managed to wrestle it off. The converter was gone, but then the bare lens at least was still working. So sometimes even brute force can help in certain situations.
Yeah. And one thing that I honestly think that every photographer should travel with, and it might sound a bit weird, just go to like your local dollar store and get a little thing of two-part epoxy. If you have something that needs to be fused back together, you're much better off, having something like that, an epoxy that can really bond things together like that.
Yeah.
I remember years ago a client dropped their lens on a trip and it looked really bad. I mean, it looked really bad, and I managed to kind of epoxy it together sort of, and it was able to still work. So these are sometimes they fall and they're trashed and there's just nothing you can do about it, but sometimes it's good to have like a little repair kit. Definitely always want to have a screwdriver, allen keys for all your things. That's at a bare minimum, because another thing that happens a lot of times on lenses or lens mounts or teleconverters is those tiny little screws get a little bit loose and all of a sudden they can't quite seat in the thing. So it's just important when you're on these trips and you've paid all this money to go on a photo shoot somewhere and all your time, that you give yourself the best chance possible of being able to stay out shooting. So you definitely have to have two bodies, and you want to have the best kind of.
That's ironic coming from you, isn't it?
I had two bodies. You should have two bodies of the same mount would be ideal, and ideally you have two lenses as well. Even obviously you can't have two big 600s if that's what you shoot with, but you should have a second option that at least you could keep shooting. You just try to minimize the chance of being completely not able to shoot.
And you know what's so frustrating as well is because then you have a little bit of trust issues after something happens to your gear like that as well. And the whole time you're kind of asking yourself, did this drop actually ruin the gear or not? And so sometimes it might help as well if you just take it out and shoot like a license plate or something just to see what the lens is doing, if the autofocus is working before taking it back into the field next. So you're more confident, or maybe something isn't working. For instance, one of my R5 suddenly started always freezing all the time.
Yeah.
And then what you would usually do on a camera is take out the memory cards, format the memory cards, take out the batteries, turn on any button or turn off any button that you can. Sometimes you can reset the the menu or reset it to the camera defaults
Like a
as
factory
well.
reset.
And put the battery back in, and usually you can at least keep shooting for a little while. With that camera body, it got so bad to the point that it would turn off literally every 5 seconds, and I would lose every shot that I've been taken in a burst prior to the camera freezing. So basically then I couldn't use it at all anymore because I was constantly losing images. So in that case, I had to then just use another R5 and had to send that off on Canon fix it. Normally, if something is wrong with the camera or you have error messages, cleaning all the contacts on the lens and the camera body and taking out the batteries and resetting the camera will usually give you at least some opportunity to keep shooting.
You start going through this sort of order of operations, like taking out, like you want to eliminate variables basically. Could it be the memory card? Could it be these batteries? Let's try different batteries. I had an issue with my R5, some people might remember me talking about a couple years ago, and ultimately what it seemed to be was the contacts between the battery grip and the actual camera body. And once I cleaned all of that, it kind of went away and never happened again. So cleaning any contacts, changing, if there's a variable that you have another one like a different battery, a different memory card, try that. And then hopefully you get back operational, and sometimes you have to send it in. And
I actually managed to shoot a whole trip in Florida, I think in 2010, with a broken shutter in my 1D Mark IV back then. And in the field, I didn't really notice it, but when I looked through the RAW files at the end of the day, I noticed that in each burst, the first photo was severely underexposed, the second photo was severely overexposed, and the rest of the images were normal. So I reached out to Canon and they said, yeah, it's probably a broken shutter, you need that replaced. But I'm in Florida, I have like 3 days left. I can't really send off all the cameras. And back then I also only had that one camera. I think my backup was like a 20D or something, so I didn't really want to use that camera. And what I ended up doing was just taking crazy long bursts all the time because I basically
Hmm.
knew the first two images were a write-off. And if I let the shutter go, I get the first two bad images again. So I just started shooting very long bursts whenever something was happening and ended up with enough usable images. And I think to wrap up this segment, one thing you have to have with you in the field is a cleaning kit for your sensor and also for your lenses. Because sometimes you think something is broken or your images are really washed out and hazy or your autofocus doesn't work anymore. And oftentimes this can be because either maybe you got a fingerprint on your teleconverter or there's some dirt built up on your front element. And these kind of build ups or fingerprints or any kind of dirt on your elements can definitely throw off your camera and make your images look quite unpleasant. And I remember one time, for instance, I was photographing at a gannet colony in a lot of strong wind, but I really wanted to change teleconverters. But unfortunately, when I changed the teleconverters, I got a whole heap of, I don't know what it was, maybe gannet poo onto my sensor, which originally
Ooh.
looked like I threw it into the dirt. And so luckily I had a sensor cleaning kit with me. And then in the car, I got it out, got a few of these swabs and some of the liquid and cleaned the sensor. Because a very dirty sensor can really ruin your trip as well, especially if you want to do video. If you do photos, you could go in and just clone it out
Hmm.
20 times and you still be fine. But if you're doing a video and there's lots of dust moving on your sensor whenever you pan your camera, that's really a ruined file pretty much.
We hope you guys have found some useful information in this segment, and if you want, maybe let us know if it's not too painful about some of your own gear disasters down in the comments.
But now it's time for the tweak of the week.
This week on the Tweak of the Week, it's all about noise removal. Now, I was just editing all these photos from St. Paul Island, and I had to shoot at higher ISOs, and my kind of go-to high ISO noise removal is still DXO Pure RAW. I still really like to blast all my files through that program, anything that I've shot at a higher ISO, or to be honest, anything really, like unless it's really low ISO 400 or something
Yeah.
like that, maybe I won't bother. But most of the time I just put everything through DxO Pure RAW. And then the second part of, for me, of noise reduction is to also run Topaz DeNoise once I get into Photoshop. So I like to think of it as kind of like a 1-2 punch for noise, because for me DxO Pure RAW clears a lot of the noise from the raw file, but Topaz, once I get to that stage, allows me to do it as a separate layer so that I can kind of mask it in or out. And what I like about Topaz DeNoise is it's also applying some sharpening. So it's kind of giving me that little bit of finishing off the noise and a little bit of capture sharpening. So what about you, Jan? What are you doing these days for noise?
Well, I've gone pretty simple in a lot of cases because it's just so convenient. So oftentimes I just use Adobe Enhance. It's just one little right click in Camera Raw or Lightroom, and there's just one slider. You set it to probably between 40 and 50%, and it usually gives you good results. So oftentimes I resort to that just because it's so convenient to use, and you also don't have to purchase any extra software. I obviously
Yeah.
have DxO Pure RAW 4 as well, and I use that especially in more trickier cases. So I think it still does a good or better job there sometimes. And some people might also wonder what sort of the main difference is between DxO Pure RAW 3. I think you use a lot of that, and DxO Pure RAW 4.
Hmm.
And the main difference I noticed there is that DxO Pure RAW 4 seems to do sort of less banding in the background. It leaves a little bit more noise, which might be what you don't like as much, but at the same time, leaving that little bit more noise in the background then stops it from breaking up and creating that banding. So I've gotten pretty good results. And when it comes to the settings, there's a lot more settings in Pure RAW now, but I usually
Hmm.
use the new D Prime XD method, and then I apply a little bit of sharpening, but usually turn off all the other corrections because I often feel like it's doing too much to the raw files. And for
Yeah.
instance, I don't want it to remove vignetting or a lot of the optical corrections. I sometimes feel like are doing too much to the image sometimes. So oftentimes I just leave it off and then do all the other tweaking in Photoshop. And if you want to try out DxO Pure RAW 4, there's a few links for you down there in the description as well, where you can just have a free trial and see what it's all about. Noise reduction used to be so difficult and was actually a daunting task trying to get rid of all that noise without losing the detail. But these days it has
Hmm.
really become like a one-click operation, which is so awesome because now we can really use these higher ISOs, and that's really what has changed our photography life as well. It's not just the mirrorless cameras that can shoot at higher ISOs, but with these cameras alone, you still wouldn't be able to use like ISO 25,600.
I think that's a great point that often gets lost in the shuffle is people think that it's just the cameras. and these new mirrorless cameras came out and it changed everything. And they have some amazing functionality, but
Yeah.
mainly that's in terms of the autofocus and things like
Yeah.
that. It's this AI software that's really, and sort of again like a 1-2 punch of like, we have these amazing autofocused fast frame rate cameras, and because of the software we're able to shoot at higher ISOs, and those, that combination of things completely opened up new avenues of how we can actually take
Yeah.
pictures of birds.
Because it's good that you mentioned the autofocus, because that was probably the biggest trouble with the DSLR cameras. You had like a 5D Mark IV in the dark rainforest, and it just wouldn't focus. It wouldn't know what was going on. I'm sure it's the same with like a 7D Mark II. It, getting dark, it
Oh,
was
for
just
sure.
pure luck. Whereas now in R5, you go 25,600 eyes, oh, a hundredth of a second, no problem. It just finds the bird, you get some shots,
Yeah.
and then you know you can clean it up after. So you're not scared of these high ISOs anymore. And this is also one reason why I don't delete too many files, because sometimes in the past you may have taken an image that was really noisy and you thought, I can never save that file, and you deleted it. But now you could actually go back to that image and re-edit it and get a pretty good result out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where you really notice the capability of this new software is when you go back. And for the Hummingbirds book, I was re-editing some old files, and it was unbelievable how much better you could do with the new software. So yeah, definitely recommended.
Speaking about editing, maybe you can give people a few more tips as well, what you did to your St. Paul Island images, because you said it was hazy, raining, so there's probably a lot of low contrast in the images and high noise, and you also want the water background to be quite nice and blue probably, which it wouldn't normally be if it's really gray and dark. So what are some of the tips that people can do to their quite dull images?
Yeah, I mean, that was a big concern of mine when I realized how dark the weather was. I saw the weather forecast and I was like, oh my God, we're just going to have nothing but white backgrounds for all these shots. And that was definitely not the vision that I had. Maybe a few high key frames in there could be cool, but not the entire portfolio. First step, put them through DXO Pure RAW, get rid of a lot of the noise. And then it's time to take those DNG files and start processing them in Adobe Camera Raw. First step for me is to apply our one of our PROSETS. I kind of usually start with our vibrant, more contrast
Same.
one. So right away, getting a little more punchy colors and a little bit more contrast. So that's already helping on those dull conditions. And then work through some Adobe Camera Raw, exposure and highlights, and trying to get the contrast and the exposure, stretching out the dynamic range, trying to, maybe add a little bit of saturation as well into the water. Luckily, shooting from the cliffs, I don't know if it was just the angle or whatever,
Yeah.
but there was still some color in the kind of intertidal kind of waves there. So it was at least not just totally white, because sometimes when you have just like gray or white, it is hard to pull out some of the water. But then, yeah, after going through processing the raw files, I would move into Photoshop and do kind of my normal workflow. But then is when I found that a lot of times there still was, the birds were lacking contrast, or, there was sort of like a fairly strong color cast on a lot of these black and white birds.
Yeah.
And that's when I started to really rely a lot on our brush pack as well. Once I kind of got to the end of my workflow, I would quickly, a lot of times I would do clean up whites, clean up blacks, and add mid-tone contrast. And I would add each of those three brushes.
Yeah.
Then I would use select subject to select the subject, the bird itself. And then because the bird is already selected, I can just simply paint in contrast or clean up the blacks or clean up the whites, because they're all the brushes are already there. So it made it very fast, very easy, and I think gave me a lot better results than I would have had otherwise.
And a few people ask how the brush pack actually works. Can you just quickly explain what you do to make it work?
Well, in a nutshell, the brush pack gives you access to a whole bunch of different actions that we've made up that create separate layers to allow you to quickly and easily layer mask in these changes that we both often make. So it gives you fast, easy, great results. And that's the kind of editing that I think both of us really like.
And here's another tip if you want to make a gray water background look more nice and blue. In Photoshop, you can go to selecting the background and then go to selective color. And in there, you go to the neutral channel and move the sliders around. That will easily make your background nice and blue. And in Lightroom, you could go to select your background and then simply, for instance, pull down the color temperature, which also should make it a little bit more nice and blue.
Well, with that said, I think it's time for the photo of the week.
My first image is by J.K. Lewis of this Kirtland's warbler, and I thought it's just a very nice image of a pretty rare bird. I think it only lives in certain areas. I think it's one of the rarest warblers in North America, and I think it's an overall very nice image. There's probably a few tweaks that I would make, but what do you think about the image?
When you think of this bird, you immediately think of these sort of stunted pine forests that they live in. So it's really nice to have, those out of focus kind of pine needles sort of framing the shot. Sometimes, like maybe if it was a different bird, different species, maybe you wouldn't want them right behind the bird's tail or something like that. But I
Mm,
don't actually mind that in this shot. If it was my image, I might go a little brighter, to be honest, and
mm.
then hold on to the brightness of the throat with a bit of masking. And there's one little pine needle over towards the right side of the frame, kind of a dead one that's sort of hanging down there that I'd probably be tempted to take out just because it's sort of bright and kind of draws your eye. But
Mm.
otherwise, I think it's a really nice shot by Jan.
Yeah, I agree. I probably would make it brighter. I was definitely thinking about the pine needles behind the tail. I like what you say about the habitat, but I think the background could also go a little bit brighter, maybe to separate the colors in the image a bit more and make the bird stand out more. And yeah, I would definitely also remove those pine needles on the far right hand side, but overall, a really nice image.
All right, so my first image this week is of this Arctic loon or black-throated diver, if you're over in Europe, by, I'm going to go with Jean Mankinen.
That's probably
And
not it.
I just thought, well, we got Jan, we had Jan, and now we have Jan in the first three here. So, um, what I liked about this image was the sort of graphic nature of the birds posturing up out of the water, and it's got this really cool kind of curve to the neck. And I just thought graphically, it's a really interesting kind of shot. I think that like it feels a bit too warm in the processing, like is maybe a bit um, too much magenta cast to it, but I really think it has a lot of potential. What do you think about it, Jan?
It's definitely a really cool image. I don't think I've ever seen a loon or a diver make a pose like that in a photo, so it's really awesome to see that a beautiful moment captured. The image is backlit, so it makes sense that it might be a little bit warmer, but I agree that it feels a tad too warm because it just makes the water have that sort of brown murky color, which we don't necessarily want in it. But overall, pretty well done, and I might be tempted to tone down some of those really bright blown out waves in the water as well, so all the attention is on the bird here. My next image is of these two roughs fighting mid-air, and this is something I always wanted to witness myself as well, finding one of these rough legs where they're all standing there posing beautifully with their big mane and fighting, and you have the midnight sun so you can basically shoot in beautiful light for like 8 hours straight. Sounds amazing, and I thought this was a really nice image, but I thought it has a few challenges as well. And I think in this image, what's the hero of the show is the two birds fighting. And a lot of other
Mm-hmm.
things sort of become a distraction, especially the way it's cropped as well. I think this would work better as a square or horizontal crop where you have more focus on the two birds. And then I'm also not sure what I think about the two other roughs in the picture, especially the out of focus one in the background. And then there's also that tiny bit of sky above the birds, kind of making a bit confusing as well. And maybe it's a little dark as well overall, except for the bright areas in the wing.
Here again, it's almost like the last image where there's a sort of this moment happening, and that's clearly the star of the show. Technically, so for example, it's cool because the birds are so weird and it's strange how they all look different, and I agree with you. I don't like, just like I don't like clipping off a little tip of a wing, I don't like leaving just a little bit of sky or something like that. I
Yeah.
would definitely either clone that background up or crop it. Well, I probably would clone the background up
Yeah.
because I don't you don't have a lot of space to crop there. So yeah, just some choices to make when editing in an image like this. But it's a really cool moment. It's definitely a spectacle that I would love to see someday. Just like you said, like it'd be a really cool thing to go and have a shoot with these amazing birds sometime.
And since you said about cropping, I feel like if you crop the image like this, you have to remove the bird underneath the other two birds as well, or not crop
Yeah.
off its bum. Would you agree? Like either have it in or have it out,
Yeah.
not have it a little bit in.
Yes, I agree. And it's where you have to ask yourself the question, and like I totally get why they put it there. It's at a lek, there's a bunch of birds, and they're thinking that's cool. But you have to ask yourself, is this thing, this part of the image that I'm choosing to include, adding or taking away from the photo. And in this case, it's probably taking away from it because it's not really, it just looks like an accident. So yeah, either crop it significantly looser so that the whole other bird is in there.
Yeah.
And that actually might be a cooler shot anyways.
Definitely. And
Because
you have
maybe
the
you'd
mountain
see,
background in as well then if you crop it
yeah,
looser.
yeah. So yeah, I think this one comes a lot down to like how you chose to present it for Instagram. And then second of all, I would recrop it to try to show the wideness of the scale. Maybe there's even another rough over here behind this one or
Yeah.
something, and maybe that makes it an overall better image.
So overall a great image, and we don't want to be too negative because we both would be quite happy to have some images like that, but there's definitely a few tweaks that can be made to the composition and also to some of the elements, even like that very bright foreground bit, that would definitely improve the image overall.
All right, my next image this week is by Prashant Sharma, and it's of this really beautiful little Asian emerald dove. I just love this species. Such a cute little dove with it's like the eye is way too big for its head, and it's a really cool species. I think there's a few things I would change. Let's see if Jan can guess.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting image, beautiful bird. The one thing that jumped out to me right away here is that I think they went a little bit too hard on blurring the background with the lens blur in Lightroom, for instance. I don't mind blurring the background sometimes a little bit, but I usually prefer to use other methods like cloning over it with a very low opacity, for instance, because I feel like it sometimes looks more natural. Here it feels a little bit like the background was quite close, but then they blurred it quite strongly, which helps in making the bird stand out, but at the same time can look a little bit too smooth if you overdo it. So here it's just fine. I wouldn't hate it, but I think it's just something to be careful in general. But other than that, I think it's very nice, but the framing is a little bit off probably. I think there's too much dead space above the bird. So you could either crop it tighter because the perch itself isn't that interesting, or have the bird just higher in the frame.
Yeah, that's what that was the big thing for me was I think the bird's really cute and overall it's presented quite nicely, but it just I think when we're composing these types of images, you always have to almost draw lines, like
Yeah,
imaginary lines. And if you have, like for example, in this one, if you drew a line from the bottom left to the top right, there'd be almost nothing in the upper
yeah,
triangle there, right? So this bird certainly can go higher and further to the left if you kept the crop as is,
yeah.
or you could crop it in from the top left. But it's just something we see really commonly too, these sort of compositions that just aren't quite I don't know, aesthetically pleasing. And there has
Mm.
to be a reason why you would leave all that space there. Maybe if there was the perch was really interesting and there was like a little orchid growing out of it or something.
Yeah.
But in this case, there's nothing there that warrants this
Yeah.
kind of crop.
And composition can really make or break your image. A bad composition on an awesome photo can actually make that awesome photo look quite pedestrian. And a really good composition on maybe not the best photo in the world can sometimes make it look much stronger. So making sure that you crop your images the right way, also when you present them on Instagram, can have a big impact also on how they're perceived and how many likes they get, for instance.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's one of the reasons why. So I've done several books, and with this hummingbirds book, for example, I made sure that I was placing every single photo in the frame in the InDesign file because honestly, I don't trust anybody else to. Because you're gonna have to make decisions about
Yeah, yeah.
crops, like where the page split is, all those kinds of things. And there's no way I'm turning that over to a graphic designer to do that. I want absolute control because, as you say, it can completely. You could have the exact same photos, the exact same book, all composed marginally worse, and
Yeah.
it would kill the book. So, composition's important.
So cropping seems so simple and something you don't even think about, but it's one of the things that has probably one of the biggest impacts on your final result.
It's like the easiest thing to do. You don't need any skill,
Yeah,
but it's has a huge impact.
definitely. My last image is of a bird that Glenn always has trouble to pronounce, and I wanted to try myself as well today. So it's of a hopui taken somewhere in eastern Germany, and I thought it's just a beautiful image. It's interesting that it's backlit, but for this bird, it actually works quite well because it always puts so much emphasis on that crest. It sort of shines through the crest and really making that stand out. So overall, a really good image, but I think you could go a little bit brighter on the bird, for instance, making the face and the eye stand out a little bit more. But I really like the background and the perch in this image.
Yeah, I think they've done a nice job here of trying to do something a little outside of the box, a little different. It's not your conventional portrait.
Yeah.
They've done a bunch of things, trying to line up the bird with the sun coming through backlit, framing the perch that the bird's going to land on so that there's nothing too much behind it.
See, there's one thing you could try on the bird's chest as well, because it's clearly molting or wet. So there's a lot of sort of white feathers shining through. You could use our brush to add color to dull feathers as well and just brush that over in the color of the chest, just blending that in a little bit more. It's not too bad in this situation, but if the plumage isn't perfect, sometimes tweaking it a little bit can definitely help.
All right, well, this week my last image is by our old friend Kenyan Birder, and this guy's always got some cool shots over from Africa for sure, and this is no exception here. I mean, here we have this spectacular eagle, and not only is it a really cool bird, but it's got this really interesting looking, looks like some kind of catfish. And I
Yeah.
think he's presented it really nicely, framed it out, I think it makes sense the way it's cropped, sort of 4 by 5 like that, or whatever aspect ratio this is. And I mean, if I had to nitpick, maybe there's some detail lacking in the whites on the head, it looks like, at least on my monitor here. Maybe there's a few little processing things that could be improved. And maybe the front wing position's kind of a bit awkward. But sometimes these eagles, the way they kind of lift off, it's hard
Yeah.
to get like, you're not going to get a perfect banking pose. So overall, I just thought this is one of those things where there's just a lot going on, but it's like a treat for the eyes. There's lots of cool things. What do you think about this one, Jan?
I think it's a really nice image. The main thing that's throwing me is there's a few lines in front of the bird. I don't know if that's clouds or if that's from cloning or editing or banding or something. I feel like they add a weird element into the frame that's kind of going against the way the bird is flying. So I might be tempted
Maybe
to
it's a
just
really big crop.
smooth these out a little bit. Yeah, I'm not sure. It could be crop, so it's a bit of banding or something, but I'd be tempted to smooth it out because it kind of adds that
Definitely.
diagonal line where I don't really want to see any lines. So I think having that smoother would be good. And then you could work a little bit on the bird's head. And if there was no detail in the white areas, for instance, you could use the clone tool at like 40 or 50% opacity and just clone some areas that have detail over the areas that have no detail. That just brings in that little bit of texture. And then you could also go down at the bottom with the same opacity and clone over that very dark shadow on the white as well. That just evens that out a little bit. But overall, a great shot with a good pose. And obviously having such a big catfish in the claws is pretty awesome.
This is one of those ones where, because of the moment and the sort of spectacular nature of this scene, is you can sometimes forget about those details, like you said.
Yeah.
And so when I'm finishing editing a photo, I usually like to kind of stop and then sort of do like a pan around and see if there's anything else that jumps out at me. We saw that, for example, with the dead pine needles in the Kirtland's warbler.
Yeah.
If you did a little pan around, you would have grabbed onto those and thought, I should get those. In this case, there's some of that banding, which would be really easy to deal with.
Yeah.
Super easy. And as far as the whites on the back of the bird's head, I think this could be one that it's hard for us to say because we can't see the raw file.
Yeah.
But I would be tempted to maybe do like a double processed raw file here and see if there's any detail, and then you can overlay the darker image and kind of mask it in. That might help. There's a variety of techniques that you could use to do that. But overall, it's a really cool shot, and just a little bit of processing tweaks could make it even better.
So for people that don't know, Glenn meant that you do one file that's exposed the way you want it to, and then you create a dark file where you pull down the whites, you pull down the highlights, you pull down the exposure, and usually you pull up the shadows, then it blends in more. But that file allows you to see if there's detail in there, and if there's enough detail in there, you can overlay the two files and then brush the area in that has a little bit more detail into the file with the normal exposure.
And on that note, guys, I think that's about all the time we have for this week's show. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know those camera disasters that you've had and how you saved the day, maybe. Let us know down in the descriptions, and definitely let us know if you found some helpful tips in this show. That's what we're trying to do here, is to give some good tips. So we love to hear from you guys, and if you've enjoyed the show, let us know.
And make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. And we also thank Camera Canada for sponsoring this episode, and we will see all of you in another episode very soon. Bye!
See you next time, guys.